You're watching your child struggle with reading and you're starting to wonder, is this just a late bloomer or should I be worried? Today I'm sharing the key signs to look for and the developmental age ranges of learning to read, along with what to do if you suspect that your child needs extra support in reading. Because the earlier we know, the more and the better we can help. Hi, I'm Dr. Deanna. I'm a homeschooling mom and a former K-3 teacher. Over the 20 years I spent in the classroom, I've seen hundreds of children learn to read. I've seen all different sorts of challenges and victories. Recently, I just graduated my homeschooling son, and he's off to film school, so it's a super exciting time in my life. But today I'm here to share with you strategies to help you as a parent at home with your child and to know if your child is showing signs that they might be having additional challenges that are preventing them from reading. I help parents teach with confidence and give them strategies they can do right at home that are effective and completely doable. So let's talk about that big question that's on so many parents' minds. When should I worry? To start with, let's talk about what's developmentally appropriate for each developmental stage. Even though reading is not something that our brain is naturally wired to do, there are still developmental stages and steps and milestones that our children need to achieve in order to be ready to learn to read. In preschool, ages 3 and 4, it's okay if your child is not reading yet. What we're looking for at this age is interest in books and print awareness, that they know that text is what carries the meaning. They know where to start reading on a page, which way you go. They have a general idea of how books work and that they really enjoy that reading time. Starting to learn their letters and their sounds is a great tool to have them ready for kindergarten. But again, even though there's a lot of buzz about very early reading, we don't necessarily need to worry if our children aren't reading yet at ages 3 and 4. And in fact, early reading doesn't necessarily prevent long-term problems. Remember, if your child has a learning challenge, they have that challenge regardless of when they learn to read. A learning challenge such as dyslexia is actually a different wiring in the brain. It's just having to do with the way that the brain develops or is wired. So teaching them to read earlier isn't necessarily going to help identify it earlier or prevent that. By kindergarten, which is around ages 5 to 6, we generally speaking see children have a grasp on letter sounds and letter names. Both are very important for literacy success. We also see that children tend to be able to blend very simple words, and they may start to read simple sentences, but with support. Now remember, the average age of learning to read or reading readiness is actually 6 or 7. So if a child isn't ready to read at kindergarten, it's not necessarily a sign that there are issues just yet. However, if we see some of the early warning signs, such as they have a hard time remembering letter sounds and letter names, no matter how hard you work on them, they have a difficult time recalling that information, that might be an early sign that there are some learning differences, such as dyslexia, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. So we just want to be aware and observe and be mindful. By the end of first grade, ages 6 to 7, they should now be able to read some simple sentences and simple text. This is the age where we most likely would begin to suspect that there might be some issues going on that need extra support if they are still really struggling with learning to read, decoding, and fluent reading. So in a nutshell, if your child is around ages 6 or 7 and they're still not able to recall letters and letter sounds, and they are having a difficult time learning to decode simple words, that would be the time to pause and take a closer look. Early intervention means that our children have a better chance at, not necessarily, we don't want to say overcoming this, but that they have a better chance at reading success, which is what we want for our children, right? Here are some specific signs that you can look for to know if your child might need some extra support. Now remember, it's not just that like 1 or 2 of these things are happening, but if they consistently have these issues and connected to a family history of dyslexia, that would be a definite sign that you probably need to have this looked at a little closer. So the first thing that we want to pay attention to is if our child is consistently having a difficult time remembering letters and sounds. And I know I've said that a few times, but I can't emphasize enough how much of an early sign this is with some of our children that end up being diagnosed later down the road with dyslexia or dysgraphia or a processing disorder. And it doesn't mean that your child definitely has a processing disorder if they're having struggles with remembering their letter sounds, but it is something to keep in mind and pay attention to. The next thing that I would take a look at is if your child is consistently wanting to avoid reading, that they just say it's too hard, they don't want to do it. Of course, children can vary from time to time, so it's not necessarily like a one-off, they just don't want to read, but if it's a consistent pattern, and I personally can attest to this, both my boys were fairly early readers, and when we got to chapter books, which we started with the Magic Treehouse series, and so it's a very simple chapter book series, right? But I noticed in one of my sons that he was no longer very interested in reading, whereas before he had been very excited about it. And he would just say, you know, it wasn't enjoyable for him anymore. And one time I started to really wonder about that, and I had him read aloud to me and realized that he was having difficulty following the text. And what we ended up finding out is that he had a tracking disorder. And so his eye muscles hadn't developed in a way that were tracking together. And they were having trouble following the text to the next line, or sometimes skipping over words. And when he read aloud to me that time, I realized, oh, that wouldn't be enjoyable either. So it was a matter of when the text changed to a smaller print and there was more on that page, it became much more of a heavier task for him. And that's just to remind you that just because you have an earlier reader doesn't mean that it prevents some of those challenges. We still want to be on the lookout for it, but also that, you know, it's okay if there is something that we need to address. And I want to just go ahead and say that when we find those answers to, you know, if your child does have a learning challenge, it's not the scary thing that you think it's going to be. And in fact, it can be the door to getting the answers that you need and the supports in order to move beyond that and move through that to reading success. So I just want to encourage families out there, if you have that question in your mind and you're wondering about it, but then it's like you don't know if you want to go down that path, it never hurts to rule out a learning challenge. In fact, the earlier we can rule that out or identify it is the earlier that we can get support for our children. So I really want to encourage families in that and let you know that having been in that position, it's not the scary thing that you think it's going to be. And I definitely thought that it was something I was very uneasy about, but it ended up being the way that we opened the door. We got occupational therapy. We did activities at home that supported the tracking muscles in his eyes. And it ended up being something that we worked through. So again, I want to encourage families out there to get the support that you need and not to worry about that diagnosis. Another sign that you might notice with your child that's having some challenges with reading is if they are depending on pictures too much, they are guessing words instead of actually decoding them. This might be a sign that they aren't equipped with some of the phonics information that they need, or that they're struggling with phonemic awareness, or the child is guessing based on pictures instead of using the letters. That's another indication that they may require some additional support. Also, as I said previously, if these factors are combined with a family history of dyslexia or other processing disorder, you may want to really consider getting that assessed. And even if the processing disorder is different, it's not necessarily dyslexia, but there is a higher probability for a dyslexia or other processing disorder diagnosis if there's a family history. And I know in our case, our family has a history of dyslexia, but our diagnosis for our child was different. It was a different processing disorder. So that's just a reminder that it's better to go ahead and get that looked at if you know there's a family history of processing disorders, whether it be auditory or a spatial issue. Any processing disorder like that would be a reason to have your child assessed if they're showing these other signs. Another sign that you can look for is if they're having trouble hearing beginning sounds and isolating that sound, they have a difficult time manipulating the sounds. This is phonemic awareness, and it can definitely be fixed and worked on. But if your child is having 2 or 3 of these signs, then that would be an indication by about end of kindergarten to mid first grade that we definitely want to dig a little deeper so that we can address that and give our children the supports that they need. If several of these signs are showing up, that's when I recommend that you have a professional screen them and get a professional's eyes on the situation to at the very least rule out that they need some extra supports. So what could be going on behind the scenes? There could be a range of issues, and it's so important to understand reading struggles are not an indication of intelligence or effort. Even if we have a child that's wanting to avoid the task of reading, that's more of a sign that there's something going on that we need to give them support in. Remember, behavior is communication. So we want to pay attention with our children and even ask them what's hard about something. Have them read aloud to you so you can hear what it's sounding like to them. And sometimes that's such a window, like it was for me with my own son. But if you are noticing some of these signs, it could indicate that there is a learning disability, or it could indicate a lack of some skills that can definitely be addressed. So the first thing it could be is some gaps in foundational knowledge, such as phonemic awareness and having that ability to blend sounds together. So, that's something that can be done through wordplay. I really highly emphasize that with families because it is one of the top predictors of long-term reading success. So if you don't know what phonemic awareness is yet, I encourage you to check out some of my other videos. I have tons of ideas, and I have a whole channel called Dr. Deanna's Learning for Littles, where I do episodes for children 3 through 8 that focus on these phonemic awareness and phonics skills. The second skill base they might be lacking is in systematic phonics. 90% or around 90% of children need to have direct instruction in phonics and how our letters and our sounds work. So that's another thing to look for. And again, I'm going to redirect you right back to my channel for littles, where I have tons of episodes that go over all the different letter sounds and how that works in our written language in a very fun way. But we also could be seeing some things going on, such as a developmental or auditory processing disorder. And so that's why we want to pay attention to these signs, because we can go ahead and get that assessed and get them the extra support they need if that is necessary. And as previously mentioned, we could have a learning difference going on, such as dyslexia. Dysgraphia is something that tends to affect writing more, or that spatial visual task of writing. But these are different areas that should be looked into if you are noticing a pattern of behavior, such as I mentioned before. Now, the good news is that all of these things are really responsive to the right kind of teaching methods. We know so much about the way that the brain learns now, and I know that there's so much more out there to be learned, but we have the best understanding of how learning happens, better than we've had ever before in history, and understanding these types of learning challenges. So the encouragement is that the earlier that we address these things, the better it is. And like I said, there's definitely ways that we can teach our children, even if they have some of these challenges. So here's what I recommend that you do if you're concerned. The first thing is to check out my reading readiness checklist. I have it as a freebie on my Teachers Pay Teachers, and I'll put the link down below where you can go ahead and download that for free. And that will give you an idea of what skills your child needs to have in order to be ready for reading, and will give you an idea of what you can work on with them. The next recommendation is to watch how they read. And I mentioned this before, and I talked about it with my own experience with my son, and how hearing him read really opened my eyes to what he was experiencing. So I encourage you to have your child read aloud to you, as it will help you understand what challenges they might be experiencing. Are they just having trouble decoding the words? Are they having trouble tracking the words? And that can also be information that's important to share if you do have them assessed by a professional. My third recommendation is to screen early. If you notice any of these signs, and as I mentioned earlier, like 2 or 3 combined with a family history of dyslexia, it never hurts to go ahead and have your child screened for these difficulties and challenges. And you can do that by either contacting your pediatrician and asking for a referral, or if your child is in person in a school setting, it's always great to put a written request in to your child's teacher or to the office and request that your child be screened for these learning challenges. And of course, learning starts at home. So there are tons of ways that you can get your child ready for reading and work on these skills, even if they're struggling. I have tons of ideas for you on my learning channel right here, and a whole channel, like I mentioned, for littles ages 3 to 8. So check that out so that your child can learn with joy and confidence. And don't forget, grab my reading readiness checklist for free on my Teachers Pay Teachers. Again, that's linked below in the description.